a U.S. Navy submarine officer for 20 years, long before getting into the home building industry. I'll skip any jokes about how much time I spent underwater in the 90s versus between 2006 and 2008, as we all did. So I grew up in Southern California, went to high school in Anaheim right near Disneyland, went straight from high school to the Naval Academy, graduated in 1989. My wife Melinda is here in the front row, and for those who don't know, what people in the military service do is very challenging. Military spouses also have a very challenging life, and so the whole time that we were at sea, our spouses had to take care of things. Take care of kids, take care of the house, take care of a lot of things, and so I think often they don't get appreciated as much as the people in uniform do. You know, when we see them at the airport and you say thank you for your service, a lot of times the spouses are forgotten too. So thank you for Melinda. I also have my Hamlet Homes team here in the front row. Hopefully there won't be too much heckling, but after a little bit. After 20 years in the Navy, I went to business school in Boston. I worked in consulting in Atlanta for a couple of years with Boston Consulting Group, and then joined the housing industry in the perfect year in the state of Florida in 2006, right as the crash was happening. I was working for Centex Homes at the time, and we probably laid off 90% of the company over the first 3 years that I worked there, so glad we don't have to do that again. Then I went from Centex to John Wheeland Homes. I see Bob's here in the audience, who I worked with at John Wheeland, then Fisher Homes, and then moved out to Utah in 2016. My partners and I bought the company from the founder in 2017, and we built a little bit over 100 homes a year. So I've seen a lot of challenges in the military, a lot of challenges in home building, and we're going to talk a little bit this morning and save some time for questions at the end about the similarities between the two. You probably read that in the program, so I'm going to skip right past that. We'll start off right up front with some cool stuff that submarines do. Hopefully all of you have seen the movie Hunt for Red October with Alec Baldwin and Sean Connery. There's a bunch of pictures of emergency blows in there, which is something that we do every submarine at least once a year. You go down to test depth, you do an emergency blow where high pressure air at about 4,500 PSI pushes all of the air, or all of the water out of the ballast tanks, makes the submarine very positively buoyant, and you pop up out of the surface just like in those pictures there. Here's some pictures of submarines blowing stuff up, which is always a fun way to start a meeting. I bet none of the other HBA presentations, including stuff blowing up in their first couple slides. A little bit of trivia. If you aren't aware, you can see in this picture in the top right, in that little GIF, torpedoes back in World War II used to collide into the side of the ship that they were trying to sink, and then we figured out there's a better way to sink ships than just poking a hole in the side where the crew can try and patch that hole. So now what torpedoes do is right before they get to the ship, they dive down underneath it and they detonate under the center of the ship. So in that picture or that video, you can see it sort of lifts up the center of the ship, creates a huge air pocket underneath it, and then as the weight of the ship descends into that void of air underneath it, pretty much snaps the keel in half. So you can't patch that hole the way you used to be able to do in World War II. That part of the presentation does not have anything to do with home building. All right, so here's a picture of a submarine control room. You've got a helmsman, you've got a chief of the watch behind him. Obviously, looking at that screen, you can see that there are a ton of gauges and meters and controls and buttons and alarms. That is different than the way that we build homes, but those of us who are in the home building industry know that home building is also complex, right? We don't just have 3 subcontractors working on a house, we have hundreds. And we don't just have 4 or 5 suppliers bringing in all of the materials, we have hundreds again. So it is a complex process, and the importance of how you manage a complex process is that if you don't make it very deliberate, if you just let each superintendent do it their own way, you're going to have problems. So on a submarine, we put a lot of policies and procedures in place to ensure that things run smoothly. In a home building company, it's equally important that we do the same thing, right? We can't have the plumber gets told by Superintendent A to do it one way, and Superintendent B tells them to do the same house a different way or in a different order. So having structure in place so that operations go smoothly is equally important in both businesses or industries. Another point that we share in home building in common with submarines is that it is a hostile environment. At our company, we had someone was injured, one of our subcontractors was injured on a job site last year. We do training on safety all the time. We do training on fall protection. I think during this week's IBS, there were about 6 sessions on ladder safety 101. And so it is important in a hostile environment that you put process in place, you maintain a focus on safety, and you pay attention to the details so that things don't go wrong, because when they go wrong, people can get hurt or killed. On a submarine, for the non-engineers in the room, 1 atmosphere of pressure at sea level is 14.7 pounds per square inch. Every 100 feet that you go down adds 3 atmospheres. The unclassified number for how deep we can go is 800 feet. We can go deeper than that, but I can't say how much. So if you take a submarine down to 800 feet, that's 24 atmospheres of pressure, or 353 pounds for every square inch. So if you have a square foot, 25 tons. A square yard, 229 tons of pressure on that 1 square yard of surface area. These pictures that you can see on the right side, we would once every year or so do what we call a dependence cruise, where friends, family, parents, kids could go to sea with us in the morning, come back in the afternoon, just to experience what your service member in your family does for a living. And so when we go out and do a dependence cruise, we take styrofoam cups, like the ones that you see on the left, and every guest, Melinda got to do this with us, gets to write their name and the date on the styrofoam cup. You put it outside of the pressure hole in one of the lockers where we store the mooring lines, and then we go down to test depth and we come back up, and this is what they look like afterwards, because that extreme sea pressure has essentially taken all of the air bubbles out of that styrofoam cup and made it half the size that it was before. Another important part of what we do in the military is training, and this definitely applies to home building. So you've got a hostile environment, you've got dangerous work that's getting done, and you've got a distinct process that you need to follow. Well, if you want your whole team to follow a distinct process, then you need procedures and you need training so that everybody knows how to do it. You can't just expect all your superintendents to intuitively know how to get everything done, and they all do it consistently the same way. So that is actually a diagram of what a nuclear reactor looks like. And we do 2 types of training in the military. One type is knowledge training, and the other type we call prac-facts, or practical factors. And that's where you actually have to demonstrate something, not just talk about it, right? And so for the sales team, one of the things we try to emphasize is that you can tell a sales rep, hey, it's important for you to build trust and build rapport with your customers and your prospects. But that's very different to say to a sales rep, what are you going to do when you first meet a customer? I'm going to build trust. Okay, well, how are you going to do that? So we do role plays. And a lot of companies put secret shopper programs in place so that you have some outside third party come in and they have a hidden camera and a microphone and they record that whole conversation with a sales rep as if they're a buyer, and then you can use that and give feedback to the sales rep about how that experience went and what could you have done better. Were there any words that you chose that could be worded differently? So on a submarine, we not only go through and tell everyone, you have to memorize that diagram, and you have to be able to draw that diagram on a blank piece of paper so you know how the reactor works. We're also going to take that same crew and we're going to go in and we're going to open a circuit breaker and we're going to shut down the reactor when we're 400 feet underwater. And we're going to see what they do. And you've got a drill team that is in the background wearing red hats who are going to evaluate, and they're going to step in if any safety issues happen. But that is a real world situation where the watch section is not just saying what they're going to do, they really are underwater, and they really did shut down the reactor, and they really do have to restart the reactor and come up to a shallow depth and follow all of those procedures, not just tell you what they're going to do. All right, so we've talked about policies and procedures. With the reactor plan, every engineer on every submarine, and we've got over 50 of them in the Navy right now, has behind their head on a shelf what we call RPMs, or reactor plant manuals, and they're about 4 inches thick with hard covers on the outside, and there's volume 1 through volume 20. And they have to learn all the stuff that's in those books. But then when something goes wrong, if the reactor shuts down, they go to the book and they pull it out. They know their immediate casualty procedures. So sort of the first minute, the first maybe 3 or 4 steps when the reactor shuts down, they're going to give out orders to their team and tell them what to do because they've memorized that. But then they pull out the book, just like in home building, we've got checklists. So we have superintendents, we have construction managers who have built hundreds of homes, but when they go to do a frame walk, they should still be using a frame walk checklist because it's written down and they're less likely to overlook something or miss something when they're following the checklist that's in front of them. So that's another example where complex systems, complex processes, you want people to be well trained, you want them to know what to do, you want them to practice it and get repetitive competence with it, but you also want them to use procedures and checklists so that simple things don't get overlooked. We actually had a home that we built a couple years ago where something got missed on a frame walk checklist, and as the home was finished, we noticed that one of the windows was off from where it was supposed to be, maybe 6 or 12 inches, but it was pretty noticeable. That would have been very easy to fix at the frame stage, much harder to fix after the home is complete and there's stone on the front of the house. So it's important for us to catch things early in the process and fix them as quickly as we can. We also have, one of the things about submarines, up on the screen you can see it says everybody is well trained as an individual, but they also know what their part is. And so in home building, we're the same way. We have different departments. We've got a sales team, we've got an accounting team, we've got a production team and a warranty team, and they all work together. It's important for them to know what the other people on the team do so that they're all using the same language with their customers. But we're not going to ask a superintendent to go sell a house tomorrow. They're going to do their part as a superintendent and they can help the company be successful, but they each have their own job. On a submarine, we talk about how everyone has a specialty, but there are certain areas that everyone has to be familiar with across the board. So for example, if there's a fire on a submarine, that's a huge emergency, right? You're underwater, you're in an enclosed environment. Every single person, we had a crew of 143 people on a submarine, they are all trained to fight fires, every one of them. They all know what their part is. They all know whether they're on a hose team. Do they go to damage control central? Do they help, bring fire extinguishers to the scene or bring a hose? They all know what to do. And that is one area where they're all cross-trained. But we have a specialty called reactor operator. And those are the guys who raise and lower the power level of the reactor plant. The reactor operator doesn't do the same thing that the electrical operator does. And so they each have their own specialty, but they have some areas where they're all cross-trained as well. Do you have a question about that?
No, but you just triggered something, and because it's steam that controls reactor power, not the reactor operator. But
Yes.
I'm sorry, it was involuntary.
No problem. Steam does control reactor power, that's correct. So casualty drills, I've mentioned a little bit already. We constantly test our systems and we test our crews. And this is one of those areas where I think most home building companies probably could do more to improve their operations and their teams than we do, right? We do a lot of training that's more academic, right? What are the things you want to say during a homeowner orientation with your customer? We talk about it in the conference room, but we don't role play it as often as we could to make sure that we work out all the bugs and get it even more efficient. On a submarine, we do casualty drills every week. And there are some times of the year where we will do 4 or 5 days in a single week, where we're pretending like there's a fire, we're pretending that the reactor shut down, or we're pretending that water's leaking into the submarine and everyone knows where to go. It's a little hard to see in that picture, but there's a guy back here wearing a red hat. Usually the guys running the drills are wearing red hats, and then everyone who's not wearing a red hat has to know what switches to operate and what valves to operate and what orders to give so that you can get through that emergency situation. Then when it happens for real, you know what to do and you can deal with it, and it's not as much of a crisis as if you hadn't trained and prepared for that. So back to the training. We train on a lot of different possibilities of what might go wrong. When something goes wrong in the real world, it rarely is exactly what we thought was going to go wrong. And so that's why we train so much. And when something does go wrong, it may not be exactly what you trained on, but the fact that you trained on it so much is why you aren't going to panic. You're going to know what to do, and you'll be able to calmly deal with the situation. So there was a time when this was on my first submarine. So I'm probably 23 years old at the time. And we had done a lot of training on how do you deal with injuries? How do you deal with something like leak or radioactive spill or hazardous material? So mercury is a hazardous material. It can be corrosive, it's dangerous. So we had an electrician, we were in port, and he was changing fluorescent light bulbs in the reactor compartment. He dropped one, it broke, he cut himself, he's bleeding, and we've got mercury. So he reports to me, and that quote that's on the screen is what I actually announced over the microphone system on the submarine to let everyone know. There's a hazardous material spill and a contaminated injured man in the reactor compartment. We had never trained on that quote, right? We never trained on all of those possibilities of those things going wrong at the same time. But each of them individually we had trained on. And when I made that announcement, we had people running all over the place who knew what to do, where to go to deal with the spill, where to go to deal with the injury. And it was a relatively minor event that was easy to fix, and he wasn't badly injured because he just cut himself on a broken light bulb. But it's an example of the fact that what happens in real life is rarely the same as what you train on, but that doesn't mean there's not a benefit for the training. And the more you train, the more easy it is for your team to respond calmly and effectively when something does go wrong. Any questions on that? Does that make sense? Okay. All right. If anyone does have questions, we don't have to wait until the end for them, by the way. All right. So, one of my big takeaways from the 3 different submarines that I was on is that the role of leaders is to set up your teams for success. If you think about most great leaders, there are some throughout history, military leaders, Patton and others, who get all the credit for helping us win the war, when in reality, it's the team that does most of the work that helps an organization be successful. And so one of my biggest takeaways from my time in the military is that as an officer, most of the work that got done on our submarine, I did not do myself, and most of the officers don't do themselves. They provide direction for the team, we'll give orders on where to go and what to do, and we train our teams and work together with our teams, but the crew is the group that's really getting most of the work done. And so you want to think about it from, as a leader in a home building company, in the military, in any organization, you want to think about what can you do to help set your people up for success. So a lot of that is training. Some of that is role plays and rehearsing for what might go wrong. A lot of it is professional development as well. At our company, we encourage everybody on our team, if they want to go get a college degree, if they want to take a specialty course or go to a training seminar, take a negotiation course, it doesn't matter what it is. If it's something that they're interested in and we think it may benefit them in their career and help them, then we want to help pay for that and encourage them to develop themselves. As leaders, that's something that we can all do at any time, is think about our team, what skills are they lacking in, what do you want to develop in them, maybe it's a strength that you want to help emphasize and help them get even better at what they're already very good at. But constantly be thinking about ways that you can set your team up for success, help them be more successful, and then the whole organization ends up being more successful as well. One of the best things about the military is that you get responsibility at a very young age. So you graduate from college, you go to nuclear power school. I went in Orlando, Florida. Then you go to a land-based nuclear reactor plant. I went to Saratoga Springs, New York. That's 6 months at each of those schools. Then you go to submarine school in Connecticut, and then you get to your first submarine. When you get to your first submarine, the focus is on engineering for the first year. So you spend about an entire year learning everything you can about how that steam plant and how that reactor plant works. Then you get qualified as engineer, and then you start working on your qualifications for the rest of the boat, the front half of the boat, when you drive and launch missiles and fire torpedoes. When you're done with that, so on this uniform, you can see that gold pin is the dolphins, that is your warfare pin as a submarine crew member. So silver dolphins for the enlisted crew, gold dolphins for the officers. That's what everyone aspires to do when they get to their first submarine. Shortly after I got my gold dolphins on my first submarine, I was probably about 25 years old at the time. We're leaving Pearl Harbor, and I'm up on the bridge. When you're on the bridge, you've got the officer of the deck, you've got a lookout. When you're leaving port, you'll also have the captain of the submarine, a second lookout, and sort of an assistant officer of the deck. So there's like 5 or 6 people up there. It's very crowded, up on top of the sail, as you can see in that picture. So we leave Pearl Harbor. We're now a few miles away from land, and the second lookout goes below, the assistant officer of deck goes below, and the captain taps me on the shoulder, and he says he's going to go below also. So he goes below, and now it's just me and the lookout. So the lookout's very young, he was 17 years old at the time. I'm kind of nervous because this is my first time being on the bridge of a $2 billion submarine with just me and the lookout, and everybody else is down below, and I'm in my mid-20s. So I turned to the lookout, and I said to this guy, I said, this is my first time being up here with just one other person on the bridge, and everybody else in a crew of 140 or so people is down below, and we're on the surface. driving as fast as we can to the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And the lookout turns to me and he says, "Sir, this is my first time up here alone also." So, like, neither one of us had ever done this with just the two of us and without having a bunch of backup and support around us. But we had been trained for it. The captain had told us what to do. My lookout had been trained by other lookouts who had years of experience. So there's a process in place to make sure that you're not going to fail when you get to that first time doing it alone. But if you think about that level of responsibility that he had at age 17 and I had at 25, there aren't many environments or businesses or industries where you get that much responsibility at that young of an age. And that, I believe, is also something that our industry has in common with the military. You get a lot of responsibility at a very young age. It helps people develop their skills, be successful, and that's a good thing. It's something that we should encourage, and we should tell young people who are trying to decide what their career is going to be, we should encourage them to consider our industry because of the benefits that can come from that responsibility. All right, another military saying. You get what you inspect, not what you expect. For us at job sites, this applies when cleanliness is not being maintained the way we want it to be. Homes are dirty. Subcontractors are eating in the house or smoking in the house, doing things that we don't want them to do. We want to talk about going to the bathroom in a house that doesn't have working plumbing. Sometimes the houses get messy along the way and job sites don't get cleaned up as much as we should. You will see people polishing the ship's bell, cleaning the anchor chain, which is just going to get dirty and rusty and mollusks all over it. You'll see people when ships are in port, not just submarines, but any ship, painting over and over and over again and maintaining a high standard of cleanliness, even though this ship is going to go to sea in seawater and just get rusty and dirty all over again and then need to have the rust scraped off and then be repainted. The military does have a reputation for being somewhat obsessive with cleanliness, and part of the answer to that is that it is part of maintaining high standards, but another part of it is that it serves a purpose, right? If you allow there to be dirt on your ship or your submarine and you don't do anything about it, then it's just going to continue to get worse and worse. It's going to be seen as acceptable. This is okay, right? The captain walked by my dirty bunk and didn't say anything, so the captain must not care. And so I don't need to worry about doing anything about it next time he comes by. The bottom picture on the screen is what's called a FOD walkdown. So on an aircraft carrier, not a submarine, before they start flight operations, they line up, dozens of people, arm to arm, shoulder to shoulder, and they walk from one end of the flight deck to the other. And they look for any little tiny thing they can find, right? It could be a little piece of a rock. It could be a screw or a nut or a bolt. Doesn't matter what it is. If that thing gets sucked up into a jet engine, it can cause a plane to crash. And so you think, oh, these little tiny things aren't that big a deal, but they can be. And so that's another good example for us to keep in mind in our industry, right? It's not enough to just tell our subcontractors and tell our superintendents that job site cleanliness is important. We need to actually back that up and put something in place. We have someone from our team at Hamlet Homes go out to every neighborhood every month, because the on-site community team, the superintendent and the sales rep who are in that neighborhood every day, sometimes they get snowblind and they might not see, oh, there's a dead plant at the entrance to our new neighborhood. They might not notice that because they drive past it every day and they've seen it, slowly dying over the past month. So we encourage them to look at every neighborhood with a fresh set of eyes every day. But if they miss it, we also have somebody from the office and somebody from the management team who goes through every neighborhood every month. and scores it and uses a checklist to make sure that our high standards are being maintained in that neighborhood on a constant basis. On an aircraft carrier, it could cause the plane to go down. For us, it could cause a customer who wanted to buy in that neighborhood but decided not to because they didn't like the look of the neighborhood when they came in. Oops. Okay, so this we've talked about a little bit already. Cross-training versus specializing. We think at our company, Hamlet Homes, that it's important for there to be cross-training to some extent because you want the sales team to know what the superintendents are doing every day, and the purchasing team, and the warranty team, and the architecture team, they all have to work together. And part of that is, if you know what the other people in the other departments do, you have a little bit more respect and appreciation for them, so that you're not dismissive of, oh, that's just purchasing, that doesn't matter. Everybody has a hard job in their own way, and so it's important for everyone to understand what the rest of the people do, even if you're not going to be an expert in somebody else's department. But then there are some areas, like I brought up the example of firefighting, where everybody on a ship or a submarine needs to know how to be a firefighter. That's a big enough emergency that you can't just have a fourth of the crew fighting a fire. Everyone's gonna work together on that. And for us, I've got the example up there that a sales rep doesn't know how to build a house, but if a customer asks a question like, can you build me a house in 3 months or less? Everyone should know the answer to that question is no, we can't do that anymore. Maybe 20 years ago, we used to be able to, when homes were smaller and simpler and city inspectors showed up more timely. But there are certain questions where we want everybody on the team to be consistent with their answer. And so in those areas, we do need to do cross-training and home building without asking every superintendent to do what every sales rep can do and vice versa. All right, I know my team's gonna give me a hard time because it was slide number whatever before we got to attention to detail. But this is obviously important in the military and obviously important in home building also. I brought up the example earlier where we had a window that was offset from where it should be. Those kind of details we need to make sure that we get right in home building. So, the example that's on the screen, there's two main types of submarines in the U.S. military. We have attack submarines, which go around and have multiple missions, but they're the ones that find and sink enemy ships and submarines. And then we have ballistic missile submarines that go out and hide in the middle of the ocean and provide our strategic deterrence with the big long-range nuclear missiles. So this is an attack submarine silhouette, 360 feet long from end to end. Shallow water operations is something that we all train to do. So normally, you drive around in the middle of the ocean, you're maybe 150 to 400 or 500 feet deep, and that's measured from the surface of the ocean to the keel, bottom of the submarine. In shallow water operations, if you want to get close to another country's coast to listen to what they're doing, hypothetically, most coasts have more shallow water than the middle of the ocean does. And so submarines train in very shallow water. And in this example, we measure depth in fathoms, so a fathom is 6 feet. So 15 fathoms of water is 90 feet of water depth. And most submarine crew members have operated either on a mission or for training purposes in water that is 15 to 20 fathoms deep, so shallow water operations. As you can see in that diagram, 90 feet of depth, the submarine is typically 50 feet from the keel to the top of the periscope, and so that only gives you 20 feet from the bottom of the submarine, or the bottom of the rudder, to the bottom of the mud. And that's if you're driving perfectly flat and level. So earlier we saw that picture of the control room where you've got two guys who are driving the boat. One of them is controlling the course and also controlling depth and course, and the other is controlling the angle. So you can use the stern planes at the back of the submarine to take an up angle or take a down angle to help you get to where you're going. If that guy who's operating the stern planes, who's responsible for the up and down angle, isn't paying attention, it only takes 2 to 3 degrees of angle to stick the rudder into the bottom mud when you're in water this shallow. So that's a real world example of how attention to detail matters and what can go wrong if someone's not paying attention. In our world, that same thing applies, right? In home building, you don't get the window in the right place, it's gonna be really hard to fix it after the fact. Or if the customer asks for a certain carpet and gets a different carpet, they're going to be upset when their house is finished. Right? All of those little things add up, and attention to detail does matter. All right, I think we're getting close to the end, and then time for questions. So, after submarine service, I mentioned I went to business school, then I went to consulting, and then I went to home building. The number one question that I got asked when I was coming out of business school and interviewing with consulting firms was, we help big companies and CEOs solve their biggest problems. So you drove submarines for 12 years or however many. Why do you think you're going to be able to help us as a consulting firm help these big Fortune 100 companies? And my answer to all those interviewers was, yes, I drove submarines for a while, but that wasn't really my job, right? I don't think of myself as a submarine driver. You look back at what I did in those 12 years on active duty, and it was solving problems. So, 2 examples that are up on the board, or 3 examples that are up on the board. We have a crew of 143 people on an attack submarine, and we have 96 bunks on board. So how do you deal with that? This is actually a question for the audience. Anybody want to take a guess? Shifts? Yeah, that's one way to do it. Other ideas? So shifts is one of them. We actually call it hot bunking. And so you'll either have hot bunking because the bunk never gets cold. So you either have 2 guys who share one bunk and one works while the other sleeps, and then they switch up. Or you'll have 3 guys who share 2 bunks, so you have a little bit more flexibility. But that's one of the ways that we deal with this problem. Another way we deal with it is if you look at that picture on the right side of the screen, that's the torpedo room. And so we've got room in the torpedo room to carry on an attack submarine Mark 48 torpedoes and Tomahawk missiles. We rarely go to sea with every stow full of torpedoes and missiles. And so what we'll do is if we go to sea and we've only got, let's say 8 or 12 torpedoes and missiles, and you've got blank slots in between them, we'll take a piece of plywood, put it between 2 missiles, put a mattress on it, and that's somebody's bunk. So that's how we did it. And there's a unique example where, our submarines were designed with a bigger crew than the number of bunks. We've got 2 solutions for that problem. One is hot bunking, and one is using the vacant space in the torpedo room. And between both of those solutions, we've solved that problem. And there's 60 submarines that are US submarines driving around in the oceans right now that are using those 2 solutions for that problem. Another example of problem solving. So when I was being interviewed by these consulting firms and they said, you drove submarines, how are you going to help CEOs solve their problems? And I said, well, I was a problem solver, and here's 2 real world examples, okay? I was on a submarine in the engine room where we were 800 feet underwater and the reactor plant shut down. That was a problem that needed to be solved, and I had a team around me to help solve that problem, and that happened more than once, and we dealt with it, and it was fine. I also had a very different problem where I was a division officer, again, mid-20s age. For me, he was probably 18 or 19 at the time, and he got in a bar fight. We were going to see tomorrow morning, and he ended up in jail tonight. And that's a problem that needed to be solved, right? That wasn't part of driving submarines, but that was part of my job as his division officer, was to figure out how are we going to see tomorrow? How am I going to get this guy out of jail tonight? He was in a real bar fight, and so he wasn't there for no reason, but it still had to be solved. And so for us, as whatever our role is within our home building company, I think that's something important for us to keep in mind. If there were no problems to be solved, they wouldn't need us there in whatever role we're in, okay? And sometimes we have challenging, frustrating days where a customer's being really difficult, or a building inspector, or somebody in another department within our own company is making us want to pull our hair out. But if we didn't have those challenges and those problems to solve and overcome, our company probably wouldn't need us in the role that we're in right now. So another takeaway of similarities between the two industries. All right, a few other lessons here. The first one on this screen, I think, is one of the most important for us to recognize. I went straight from high school at age 17 to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. That entire first year is brutal by design. So a lot of people drop out. It's supposed to be really hard. It is hard. But one of the things I didn't realize when I was in that first year, that after the fact I did realize, is that part of the process they take you through at Annapolis is putting you in situations where you cannot possibly win. And one of the things they would do is they would give us a list of 20 things that you have to get done between now and 24 hours from now. So tomorrow at 8 a.m., you have to know these 20 things. What's the top speed of an F-14 Tomcat? What's the length of a 688 class submarine? What's the menu for noon meal tomorrow? How many days till the Army-Navy football game? It's a long list, and most of it's trivia, and it's not going to help save the world or do anything important. But you only have so many hours in the day, and you've got sailing class this morning, and you've got wrestling class this afternoon, and you're going to march in a parade at 3 p.m., and your day is completely booked from now until you go to bed. And then tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, they're going to ask you those 20 things that you were supposed to memorize. And there's no possible way you're going to get all those things done. So one of the things that you learn, those who are successful in this environment, is I'm not going to give up, right? Just because I can't memorize all 20 lists of things in the next 24 hours doesn't mean I'm going to do none of it. You learn to prioritize, and you figure out, okay, well, which of these 20 things am I going to get yelled at for the most if I mess it up? And which ones am I going to get yelled at for the least if I mess it up? And if you're going to get yelled at only a little bit, then ignore that stuff. Don't worry about that, and make sure you nail it on the other stuff that is important. So you learn how to prioritize, and then you show up the next morning, and some junior or senior is going to yell at you because some of those things you didn't learn and memorize like you should have, but you're only going to get yelled at a little bit because you figured out how to prioritize correctly. So don't give up on the challenging days, still do your best, and learn what's important and how to prioritize. That definitely applies not just in home building, but in life and in the military also. You don't have to be flashy to be effective. U.S. submarines comprised about 2% of all of the U.S. ships during World War II, but they sank about 50% of the Japanese merchant fleet to help put an end to World War II. And so that was just a reminder of the fact that, submarine service is known as the silent service, and they're not always front and center by design, but they can be very effective. And we all have people on our teams who are like that, right? Don't overlook the people who are not vocal and loud and outspoken, but they get the job done, they do it successfully over and over again consistently. We talked about the example of not enough bunks. In our industry, make do with what you have is often what's required of us, and that's something the military does very well also. We talked about training, and hiring great people is something that our industry gives us more flexibility than the military has. If you're in charge of a division or a department in the military, you don't get to pick your people, they get assigned to you. And you also can't fire them as easily as you can in private industry. So once you've got your team, in the military, you're sort of forced to make the best do that you can with what you've got, because you don't have as much flexibility in hiring and firing. So those are a few of my takeaways from my time in the military. My contact information is up on the screen, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has at all. Yeah. Oh, and if you could, make your way to the mics if you have questions, since the session's being recorded also, or you can just speak loud and I'll repeat it.
Yeah, so this relates to what you were talking about at the very end. Did you have a protocol to help decide between someone that just needs more training and someone who's sort of incapable or not a great fit for the team? And how would that relate to homework?
So in the military, you definitely do have protocols, and you have a pretty thorough performance review process where everybody gets a review every year. But the default is they're assigned to you and they're part of your team, and you have to work with them, and you're not getting rid of them unless they're so bad or so incompetent that you can document over a long period of time that they're not capable of doing the job. Then you're not getting them reassigned somewhere else. That's very rare. Usually you have some people who are above average performers and some who are below, and the ones who are below, you've got to work with them and make do the best you can. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, so in like running a business now, it just feels like a very subjective, emotional decision that we've had a couple of employees we waited way too long to kind of get rid of, and I just wonder if there is like a helpful protocol that it's like 3 strikes or whatever the case is.
Yeah, the military doesn't have hard and fast rules like 3 strikes and you're out, but as I said, the default is you're going to have to work with this person, and it's extremely difficult to get somebody removed from their job. In our home building company, we have the same sort of mentality that you want to work with who you've got, and you want to develop them and coach them up before you let them go as sort of a last resort. But we make sure that our guideline among our leaders and managers is nobody should be surprised if they get let go, right? They should be given multiple opportunities to step up and be told specifically what they need to improve before they're going to be let go. So, yeah, Jamie? Oh, all right, go ahead.
I appreciate it. Florentine Christian, Los Angeles AV builder. And this is my question for you. I want to know, with your military training, how do you deal with millennial and Gen Z mindsets, right? Where, I'm a Gen Xer, so I do come from a generation of like, work hard, go above and beyond, put forth the effort. And, I'm finding the younger generations they want to be rewarded for showing up. They want, work-life balance, which is awesome. I'm a supporter of their idea of work-life balance, and mine, to me, looks like we're lowering standards. Like how do we maintain high standards of hard work and pride in the work that we do, and also accommodate this newer generation that's coming in and has very different ideas about what work ought to be?
Yes, good question. So I guess the short answer is I take my military hat off when it comes to millennials who don't have, there are a lot of younger generations who don't have the same work ethic that many of us were raised with. And I think we're not in the military, which means we can't just give people orders and tell people what to do. And I left active duty in 2001. I retired from the reserves in 2009. All of the jobs I've had non-military since then require a lot more of a collaborative leadership style, to answer your question. And so, we've got a lot of our management team who's here with us today, and I think we all recognize that every person is unique, and you need to find that right balance between being too much of directive, just like shut up and get it done is a little bit harsh. But on the other hand, you don't want to be too hand-holding and tolerant of people who aren't willing to work hard. And so, not every employee, we've got about 50 employees, not all of them are the same. Some have different work ethics than others, and some prioritize work or family more person to person. So the short answer to your question, I think, is that it depends on the manager and it depends on the individual employee, but you've got to strike that right balance with everyone between getting as much productivity out of them as you can, without sort of being dismissive of their opinions also. So, did that answer your question? Sort of? Okay. Jamie?
Jamie Walker with Walker Home Design and Quick House Plans. I used to work for a builder that did performance reviews yearly for all their employees. When I started my companies 24 years ago, I did a lot of coaching and asked, what was better. To use maybe a naval term, how often should you correct the course of the ship? So we started doing monthly reviews with our team, and that became pretty difficult and took a lot of time. So we went to quarterly. Do you have a recommendation on performance interviews, how frequently and how often, and what kind of questions do you like to ask?
Sure. At our company, we do annual reviews, but we also agree that that's not frequent enough for course corrections. And so we try to get managers and their direct reports talking as often as possible, but at a minimum, we have a monthly requirement that every manager and each of their direct reports has to get together for what we call a monthly one-on-one meeting, just to touch base. It can be half an hour to an hour, but it's how are things going? What long-term stuff do you want to be working on? What professional development do you want to be working on? So that's sort of a check-in that is a little bit more formal than passing each other in the hallway, but not as formal as an annual performance review. So that's how we struck that balance. I will say that the military is very good at a lot of things, but I personally don't think performance reviews is one of them. They have made efforts to try and improve the process, but there was a time where you got like an A through F type of letter grade, and there was so much grade inflation that everybody got straight A's in all the categories, and if you got one B, then you were probably not going to get promoted. They've made changes since then, and if you have 10 people who report to you, you can't give all 10 of them straight A's. And so they've tried to force some scaling in the grading system, which has made it better, but it's still far from perfect, for sure. Yes, sir.
My name is Dan, I'm from Syracuse, New York. Like you, I served as a lieutenant in Nuclear Navy. And I'm going to ask you a real world question to see how you answer this. By the time I got out of submarines, women were not integrated on submarines, and I'm wondering if you saw that in your career. I think some of the audience would appreciate how the Navy saw that.
Sure. So I left my last submarine in 2001. I think 2010 was when the U.S. military, Secretary of Defense, changed the policy to allow women to serve on submarines. And I think the first female was awarded her dolphins in 2016. So it's been less than 10 years since the first dolphins were awarded. I think it's a good thing that that change was made. I'm sure the integration was not easy, and there were challenges, just like when they put women on combat ships. I'm sure there were challenges, but if there are women who want to serve in that capacity and have, they meet all the physical requirements and intellectual requirements to qualify, then I think they should be allowed to serve, and I think it's good that they do now, but having, both genders on board, it has its challenges. I'm guessing that one of the challenges we had back in the 90s was that there was almost zero sense of hygiene if you've got 143 men and no women on board. Everything smells. Melinda, I think, burned a couple of my uniforms when I came back from sea. And guys would have contests to see how long they could go without taking a shower. It was just kind of disgusting. So that's a good change. Yes, ma'am.
Whitney Hills, navigating in San Diego. You talked about cross-training and the importance of developing that fluency across the whole team. What are some of the most effective strategies in home building for that kind of format? Is it shadowing? Is it presentation? Something else?
Sure, that's a good question, and I think different home building companies have dealt with it in different ways in terms of cross-training. The commitment to do shadowing and say, you're on the sales team, but we're gonna take you out of sales for a week or a month and let you follow around the superintendent and learn everything they do. Most companies, I don't think, go to that extent, because it's just too much of a time commitment and it takes them away from what they're doing. But we try to do, each department does their own training. We do some all-company training across the whole company. And then we do a new hire orientation during each employee's first month or two, where they get to see a little bit about what every other department does, so they have an appreciation for it, and we see that as sort of the right balance. All right, yes sir?
So you talk a lot about practical factors, which I took away as drills in the military. So what kind of drills do you do at your company?
So we typically don't do casualty drills like fire and flooding. Although John might want to start that. Maybe we'll do fire training next month. But the drills that we do are more dealing with customers. So rather than just telling me that you're gonna build trust with a customer, let's do a role play. And in the sales meetings, we have every one of our sales reps, before they get promoted and start selling homes, they all have to present in front of the whole sales team. They have to go through a contract and present it as if they're presenting it to a customer, and go through that practice sometimes 2 or 3 times before they actually get promoted and start selling. With the superintendents, John, who's here in the front row, the superintendents report to him, and he has every superintendent go through and do a homeowner orientation, and they practice presenting the home to the customer for the first time once it's complete. So those are a few of those practical factors that we do in home building, where the employee is in a simulated environment demonstrating the skill that they're going to have to do once they get promoted. Any other questions? I think we're pretty much right near the end of time. If anybody does have any other questions, I'll stick around for a little bit, but thank you all for your time this morning, and enjoy the rest of the show.
Kevin won. Hey, Kevin. We met on the drums. Scott introduced us.